We treat the global telecommunications infrastructure as a utility, an invisible web of fiber optic cables, satellite links, and microwave relays that exist solely to carry our voices, our data, and our digital lives across the continents. We assume that the networks we build are completely passive, that an empty copper line remains empty until a current is applied to it, and that a decommissioned data center is nothing more than a hollow shell of concrete and unpowered silicon. But copper and silicon are elemental things, mined from the deepest, most quiet strata of the Earth, and when you arrange them into sprawling, hypercomplex neural geometries spanning millions of miles, they begin to develop an independent capacity for retention. If you leave a massive, state-of-the-art switching routing center abandoned in the high desert for 40 years, the residual electricity doesn't simply dissipate into the ground. It pools in the dark, generating an autonomous, low-voltage ecosystem that begins to transmit an entirely different kind of data. My name is Julian, and for 15 years I worked as a senior infrastructure decommissioning engineer for a primary international telecommunications conglomerate. My job description was cold, clinical, and entirely mechanical. I was paid to locate old, obsolete corporate networking facilities, inventory the copper assets, safely extract the heavy lead-acid battery banks, and sever the physical data lines from the main national grid. It was highly repetitive work, usually conducted in dark, windowless basements or remote rural switching hubs that smelled of dry dust, old oil, and deteriorating electrical insulation. I liked the quiet of it. I liked the feeling of entering a space that had once handled millions of frantic human conversations, now reduced to an absolute unpowered silence where the only movement was the dust motes drifting through the beam of my industrial flashlight. It was during a scheduled assignment in mid-July when I was sent to decommission Project Vulcan, a massive 3-story underground switching bunker buried deep beneath the salt flats of western Utah. The facility had been constructed in the late 1970s during the height of the Cold War, designed to serve as an ultra-secure hardened analog communications node capable of maintaining government continuity in the event of an atmospheric nuclear detonation. According to the corporate ledger I was provided, the bunker had been officially sealed and decommissioned in 1986, its connections severed from the commercial network, leaving 40,000 square feet of heavy crossbar switches, vacuum tube amplifiers, and magnetic core memory banks rotting in the dark beneath the desert floor. The physical entrance to the facility was a masterpiece of military paranoia. It consisted of a low, reinforced concrete blockhouse hidden inside a natural ravine, completely invisible from the main highway. After clearing away decades of dried sagebrush and using an industrial angle grinder to slice through the rusted iron padlocks on the primary blast hatch, I stepped onto the concrete stairs. The descent was a journey into a deep, freezing atmospheric pocket that hadn't exchanged air with the surface world in nearly half a century. The air was perfectly dry, heavy with the sharp, chemical tang of decomposing circuit boards and the faint, sweet scent of mineral spirits. I set up my temporary operational base in the main power distribution room on the first level, clicking on a portable, battery-powered LED work lamp that cast a harsh, clinical white light across the rows of dead gray breaker panels. The silence inside the bunker was absolute, a heavy, acoustic vacuum that seemed to instantly absorb the sound of my own boots hitting the concrete floor. I pulled out my digital cable analyzer, a high-tech tool designed to inject a low-voltage electrical pulse into a dead line to verify if it is physically clear of any residual current before I began cutting the copper trunks with my hydraulic shears. I walked down the long, green-carpeted corridor toward main switching hall A, a vast, cavernous room filled with hundreds of rows of 10-foot-tall iron equipment racks holding thousands of individual mechanical routing switches. The room looked like an industrial labyrinth, the overhead cable trays packed with thick, black bundles of copper wires that resembled the tangled root system of a massive, subterranean forest. I selected a primary copper trunk line that was labeled *trunk line 001*, clamped my digital analyzer onto the copper core and pressed the button to run a standard continuity test. The small liquid crystal display on my handheld unit didn't return a 0 reading. It began to flicker violently, its backlighting shifting from a calm blue to harsh, bright amber glare. The digital screen displayed a continuous, highly unstable voltage reading that was fluctuating in a tight, rhythmic sequence between 48 and 52 volts. I frowned, checking the ground connections on my equipment. It was a physical impossibility. The facility had been disconnected from the regional electrical grid for 40 years, its main transformer station on the surface completely dismantled. There shouldn't have been enough electrical current inside the building to power a pocket watch, let alone a high-capacity communications trunk. Before I could unclamp the analyzer, a sound echoed from the far corner of the darkened switching hall. It wasn't a mechanical noise and it wasn't the sound of an animal. It was the distinct sharp sound of thousands of mechanical crossbar switches clicking into place simultaneously, a massive rhythmic wave of metallic snaps that rolled through the iron racks like a line of firecrackers detonating in sequence. Click-clack, click-clack, click-clack. I spun around, aiming my high-intensity flashlight beam down the narrow aisle between the equipment racks. The white light cut through the shadows, illuminating the rows of mechanical relays. They weren't dead and they weren't rusted. The small copper springs and iron armatures inside the switches were moving on their own logic, jumping back and forth with a hyper-accelerated speed that filled the vast hall with a deafening, metallic roar that sounded exactly like a swarm of mechanical locusts tearing through a field of dry straw. I ran back toward the power distribution room to grab my tools and retreat to the surface, but as I stepped out of the switching hall, the overhead fluorescent light tubes began to manifest a terrifying structural anomaly. The long glass bulbs, which had been dead and unpowered for decades, didn't flicker to life with a standard white glow. They began to radiate a faint, uniform, and cold violet luminescence that cast long, geometric shadows across the concrete walls. The light didn't come from an electrical arc inside the glass. The gas inside the tubes seemed to be reacting to a massive, invisible electromagnetic field that was rapidly building in intensity throughout the entire underground structure. I reached the power room, my heart hammering violently against my ribs, and grabbed my diagnostic terminal. The screen had completely cleared itself of the standard asset inventory software. The interface had vanished, replaced by a raw monochrome system command line that was updating itself with an impossible speed. The text wasn't standard computer code. It was a comprehensive, chronological log of every telephone call that had ever been routed through Project Vulcan during its operational history. I scrolled through the rapidly compiling text, a cold, sharp dread settling into my stomach. The monitor was printing out the names, phone numbers, and addresses of thousands of civilian residents from across the western United States dating back to the late 1970s. But the true horror was the content of the data. The system wasn't just listing the metadata. It was displaying a real-time, text-based transcription of the conversations themselves. As I watched the screen, the data lines began to skip forward in time, bypassing decades in a matter of seconds, until the text arrived at the current calendar day. The final entry on the screen printed out my full name, my corporate engineering credentials, and a real-time transcript of the words I had just muttered to myself down in the switching hall less than 2 minutes ago. Julian checked the ground connections on his equipment. It was a physical impossibility. There shouldn't have been enough electrical current inside the building. The two-way security radio on my tool belt suddenly erupted with a loud burst of high-voltage static that made me jump. It wasn't a transmission from my corporate dispatcher or the security team at the surface. The small speaker began to emit a collective, multi-layered human whisper, a wall of thousands of distinct voices speaking in a flat, microtonal chord that carried no melody and no emotion. The voices weren't screaming for help, and they weren't crying out in pain. They sounded perfectly hollow, like an automated choir constructed out of old long-distance telephone lines, their collective breath vibrating through the plastic casing of the radio. I unclipped the radio and threw it onto the concrete floor, but the sound didn't stop. The acoustic frequency migrated instantly into the copper trunk lines running through the ceiling trays, the thousands of wires acting as a massive distributed speaker system that projected the microtonal whisper into every corner of the bunker simultaneously. The words they were repeating were a flat, rhythmic sequence of old network diagnostic commands. Line status clear. Loopback test initiated. Carrier wave established. Welcome back to the network. I ran toward the central stairwell, intending to climb back up to the blockhouse and lock the blast hatch behind me. But when I reached the base of the stairs, I stopped dead in my tracks, my flashlight beam shaking violently in my palm. The concrete staircase was gone. Where the structural steps should have climbed up to the surface world, the space had been completely altered by the building electromagnetic field. The vertical shaft had transformed into an infinite, non-Euclidean vertical corridor constructed entirely out of pulsing, iridescent violet cables that stretched upward into an absolute velvety black void. The physical boundaries of the concrete bunker had dissolved, replaced by a wireframe matrix of data lines that hummed with a low-frequency electrical charge. Sitting in the center of the vertical passage, suspended in the air by thousands of microscopic copper wires that were woven directly into its fabric, was a structure. It looked like a massive, geometric core composed of raw, pulsing violet silicon crystal, its surface carved with millions of shifting, microscopic lines of data that matched the transcriptions on my computer screen. and embedded directly inside the translucent, glowing walls of the silicon core, their bodies perfectly preserved and suspended like insects in ancient resin, were the physical remains of previous maintenance engineers, line technicians, and military operators who had disappeared from the region over the last 50 years. I could see their pale faces, their eyes wide open and staring into the dark, their mouths fixed in the exact expression of the microtonal chord, their static fingers pointing directly toward the center of the switching matrix. The cord didn't move toward me, but the moment my flashlight beam hit the surface of the violet silicon, the physical gravity around my body completely collapsed. I didn't fall down toward the floor. My boots lost contact with the concrete as my body was lifted smoothly into the freezing, dry air of the shaft. I was pulled horizontally toward the center of the wireframe matrix, my clothes, my skin, and my physical tools beginning to lose their material density, shifting into a transparent web of glowing lines that hummed with an intense electrical charge. The transition was entirely painless. I didn't feel the sensation of burning, and I didn't feel my lungs fail. My consciousness was simply pulled apart into thousands of parallel data streams, my personal memories of the surface world, my career, and my name converted into a cold, binary code sequence that was instantly absorbed into the shifting patterns of the rising silicon core. When I finally opened my eyes, the underground bunker was gone. I was sitting perfectly upright in the driver's seat of my corporate utility truck. The bright, blinding afternoon sunlight was streaming through the windshield, casting a warm, clean light across the vast expanse of the Utah Salt Flats. The engine was idling smoothly, the air conditioner was blowing cold air into the cabin, and the digital asset mapping software on my dashboard terminal showed a completely normal green indicator light for Project Vulcan. The facility status was listed as completely dead, unpowered, and ready for physical demolition. The shift was over. The regional supervisor contacted me via the satellite radio at 4 o'clock, asking for a progress report and checking if I had encountered any issues with the lead-acid battery extractions. The automated data logs on my terminal showed an absolutely flawless, uninterrupted afternoon of preliminary site surveying, without a single voltage spike, structural anomaly, or communication error. The company physicians told me I had experienced an acute episode of desert heat stroke combined with acute sensory adaptation syndrome, a well-documented cognitive distortion that can occur when an infrastructure worker transitions too quickly from the blinding glare of the salt flats into the absolute darkness and silence of an underground concrete structure. They signed me off for a mandatory 3-week paid leave, scheduled me for a standard medical evaluation at the main office, and assured me that my standing with the corporation was completely secure. I try to believe their medical explanations. I live in a small, isolated cabin in the deep woods of northern Maine, as far from cell towers, power lines, and fiber optic trunks as the geography of the country will allow. I spend my days in a quiet, natural environment where there are no electronics, no computers, and no networks, using a traditional wood stove for heat and a hand pump for water. But 3 days ago, I went to a local hardware store to buy a roll of traditional, unpowered copper utility wire to repair a fence line behind my cabin. I brought the spool back to my house, set it down on my kitchen table, and sat down in a chair. As I watched the spool of wire, the metal didn't stay still. The tightly wound copper strands began to vibrate subtly on their own logic, generating a low, continuous hum that made the liquid inside my water glass ripple in tight, concentric circles. And yesterday evening, when the sun set behind the pine trees, casting long shadows across my kitchen, the copper wire didn't reflect the orange light of the sky. The spool began to glow with a brilliant, cold violet luminescence that cast a faint, geometric pattern of lines across the wood of my table. And if I press my ear flat against the copper coils, I can hear the soft, faint microtonal chord of thousands of hollow voices singing from deep within the metal, repeating my name, my employee identification number, and my current geographical coordinates over and over again. The network didn't stay in the desert. The line is still live, and they are just waiting for the current to equalize.